Hello, I'm author and publisher Mark David Welsh and welcome to Cult Cinema Review. And this week I'll be discussing Arrow's Blu-ray release of Mario Bava's classic 1964 giallo thriller and horror film Blood and Black Lace. But before we look at the movie, I just want to extend a huge thank you to everyone who has visited my Cult Cinema blog in 2020. 3 days ago, the number of views exceeded 10,300, which passes the entire total for last year, which was also a record up to that point. And we still have 3 months of the year remaining. When I started the blog in 2013, I had no idea I would end up linked as a critic through the Internet Movie Database, or that it would command anything like that level of interest, especially considering that I mostly review very obscure movies indeed. So thank you, my friends. It's much appreciated. Now, on to today's review. There's a lot to unpack here, and before I can discuss Bava's film in any detail, we need to talk about the giallo and define it as best we can. And for that, we need to go back to the printed page and almost 4 decades before the film was made. It was 1927. Talking pictures were a new worldwide sensation when Al Jolson spoke in The Jazz Singer. The carving of the president's faces had just begun on Mount Rushmore, and the first transatlantic telephone call was made via radio from New York to London. And in Italy, the Mondadori Publishing Company began releasing reprints of classic mystery novels from the likes of Agatha Christie, Edgar Wallace, Ellery Queen, and Raymond Chandler, among others. These were cheap paperback editions and proved enormously popular with the public. Part of the reason for their success was that Mondadori had inadvertently created a marketing brand that gave the books a collective name. Each came with a cover that had a distinctive bright yellow background, and the Italian word for yellow is giallo. After the Second World War, these increased further in popularity as the population looked for an escape from recent history, and so inevitably this literature came to influence Italian cinema, although not for some time. Obviously there was little demand for dark themes and murder on the big screen in the immediate post-war years. Perhaps it was inevitable that the director who would deliver what is now recognised as the first giallo film would be Mario Bava. A top cinematographer and special effects genius, Bava had worked behind the scenes on many Italian films with fantastical subject matter before he debuted as a director with The Mask of Satan, more commonly known by its US release title of Black Sunday. Now this was a gothic horror film that became an international hit. In 1963, Bava joined a project called The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which was originally conceived as a Hitchcockian comedy thriller. In Bava's hands it became something much darker, although there are still some humorous elements which creates an almost schizophrenic feel to the final movie at times. The scenes of the serial killer at work, however, are infused with both suspense and intensity, and delivered with a level of beautiful and stylish photography at odds with the events that are appearing on the screen. It would prove to be a winning combination. It also contained an element that was to become a staple of the giallo film, the foreign visitor to Rome who becomes caught up in intrigue and a series of mysterious deaths. This convenient plot device would allow Italian producers to put an American actor into the leading role of their film, which would help sell the finished product to the lucrative US market. Bava's next 2 films, The Three Faces of Fear and The Whip and the Body, also exhibited some of the same traits, but it was 1964's Blood and Black Lace where they exploded full-blown in glorious colour onto the big screen. The movie revolves around a series of killings at a high-end fashion house owned by Contessa Cristiana, played by Eva Bartok, and managed by her lover, Massimo, played by cult movie favourite Cameron Mitchell. It begins with the killing of top model Isabella in the grounds outside the mansion where the business is based. The killer is a masked figure in black raincoat and gloves, and the murder is very explicit for the time when the film was made. There's no reliance on gratuitous blood and gore, but the woman puts up a serious struggle, and at the time murder on screen was usually a ridiculously swift affair, with the victims barely putting up a fight. The central mystery here may owe some debt to writers such as Agatha Christie, but it's well balanced and genuinely surprising, with twists and developments unsuspected right up until the end. Almost all the characters display a ruthlessness and self-interest, which is also very far removed from the work of someone like Christie or similar mystery writers of the era. There's not really a main character either. Even the police inspector is often sidelined and ineffectual, so there are no clues as to the eventual fates of anyone involved, which heightens the uncertainty and the suspense. But what sets the film apart is the stylisation that Bava brings to the table, creating something little short of a visual masterpiece. Almost every shot is a perfect blend of technique, lighting and colour, evoking a unique atmosphere that drips with fear and menace, whilst still drawing the audience deeper into the mystery. The interiors are almost impossibly rich in detail, giving the impression that the director hand-selected every single prop on display and positioned it on the set himself. Given that the film takes place in the world of haute couture, where appearance is everything, this approach is a perfect fit. Similarly, Bava shows us that this is a decadent world. Its glamour a facade masking a seedy underbelly of dark secrets, such as blackmail, adultery, unplanned pregnancy, and heavy substance abuse. The contrast of surface beauty undercut by murder and violence is very strong thematically, and brilliantly assisted by the sleazy brass and jazzy flourishes of Carlo Rusticelli's outstanding musical soundtrack. The fact that the victims are beautiful women, mostly in some states of undress, has given rise to accusations of misogyny and objectifying women, but that's a very superficial interpretation of the film. These female characters are objectified already by the fashion industry in which they work, one that has caused many more real-life tragedies than a single motion picture could ever achieve. Additionally, the killer isn't a sex maniac or a mad psycho of any sort. Each of the murders has a very specific motive woven into the complex narrative and are driven by necessity rather than just by bloodlust. Given what I've just said about the film, you could be forgiven for thinking that it was a box office smash and provoked an immediate avalanche of identikit thrillers in the classic giallo mode. Not so. The film was not a flop, but neither was it particularly successful, and the rest of the decade's Italian mystery thrillers continue with the same broad conventions they had employed prior to Bava's classic. Indeed, the maestro's next film was a western. It was another 6 years before another filmmaker took the basic setup of Blood and Black Lace, put his own slant on it, and received the acclaim that Bava never did. Young Italian director Dario Argento picked up the ball and ran with it, delivering the game-changing The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, which was released in the first few months of 1970. The fact that it was followed within just a few weeks by Bava's next giallo, Hatchet for the Honeymoon, was a double punch that proved irresistible. The giallo as we know it today was off and running. There may have only been about half a dozen similar films released that year, but in 1971 there were 33 such productions, and more the following year as the Italian film industry went giallo crazy. Now if you're thinking that all this sounds a tad familiar, masked killer, roll call of victims, then you'd be right. The giallo is commonly regarded as the forerunner of the activities of the likes of Michael Myers in the Halloween series and Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th, and all the other multiple American slashers of the late 1970s and early 1980s. Only there are a couple of crucial differences worth noting. Although the giallo sometimes features a killer motivated by revenge or a past psychological trauma, as previously stated, their motivation is also just as likely to be financial or criminally based. And the victims aren't likely to be random horny teenagers smoking pot and hooking up at summer camp either, but grown-up people inhabiting a grown-up story. Sure, some of the plots become so convoluted that they fall apart at the climax when the killer's identity is revealed, but Italian fantastical cinema has always been about style, mood and atmosphere as much as about plot and logic. So on to Arrow's Blu-ray release of the film. Now anyone familiar with the Arrow brand will already know that these are the gold standard of Blu-ray reissues. For example, in this case it is the Arrow organisation itself that has commissioned and executed the restoration of the film, so it can be presented in a pristine 2K conversion print. For that alone, this is an essential release. In terms of extras, we have an informative commentary by Bava expert Tim Lucas and a documentary about Giallo cinema, which includes interviews with some of the directors involved as well as other features. Best of all, however, are two half-hour TV shows filmed in the 1980s which feature a suntanned Cameron Mitchell discussing his career in the cult cinema arena. He acknowledges that he could have been a little more selective in terms of quality and career for some of the projects that he chose to appear in, but says it was an awful lot of fun. The only downside to these interviews are that Mitchell does not discuss Blood and Black Lace specifically, although he does acknowledge Bava as probably the greatest director that he ever worked with. And this is from a man who made films with Orson Welles, John Ford, Elia Kazan, Samuel Fuller and many other industry notables. The other unfortunate element about this footage is that Mitchell chain smokes through most of the interviews. Now this is kind of quaint in a way as a reflection of a different era, but not so much when you realise that the actor died of lung cancer 6 years later. In short, this is a classic film which all horror aficionados should acquaint themselves with, and there's no better way to do that than to get hold of this Arrow Blu-ray release. Well, that's it for today's video. Please don't forget to leave a like or share and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And I'll see you on another edition of Cult Cinema Review next week. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay well, and don't be a stranger.